Hello, bonjour, hola, moshi moshi, welcome to the MGO Music Show. And as we know, 2020 has been a chaotic year, stuck and bored in lockdown for ages, so it's given me more time than ever to listen to new music and whatever. You know the drill, here's my top 11 albums of 2020. Now, firstly, one of the things that's been great about 2020 is the amount of popular music that's taken an electropop, new disco, French house revival sort of style. So, particularly evident in the releases by Lady Gaga, the synth pop of the 1975, the synthwave of The Weeknd, the 80s stylings on Miley Cyrus's most recent album, Jessie Ware, Rasheen Murphy, Kylie Minogue. Been tons of this stuff, and it's been absolutely fantastic. But I'd say, for me, one of the best albums to do this sort of style has to have been Dua Lipa's Future Nostalgia, which is an album I was thoroughly expecting to hate when it came out because I really wasn't a fan of Dua Lipa on her debut album. She seemed like one of the most blandest, made for Radio 1 sort of artists, sort of like Rita Ora. But I was surprised because I absolutely love this album, particularly in how, as you'd expect from an album titled Future Nostalgia, how brilliantly retro it is. You've got a lot of 80s references, like on the track Break My Heart, which uses riffs from In Excess. You've got on a lot of the tracks a very new disco French house sort of influence, which is pretty prevalent when you look at the remix album, which actually features some of the original 90s French house artists like Jacques Ducamp and Dimitri from Paris. And just on the whole, she's just mastered how to do great pop, great hooks, really catchy, really danceable. And it's just consistent right throughout the album. I think another highlight for me would be the ending track, Boys Will Be Boys, which has a great sense of feminist wit to it, and also love how it very much reminds me of the sound of Marina and the Diamonds' first album, The Family Jewels. So yeah, was expecting to hate this album, but absolutely love the new direction Dua Lipa's taken, which now that I think about it, it probably relates to the fact that she's worked with Mark Ronson and Calvin Harris over the past year, artists that have both become increasingly more retro deep house stylings in their more recent work. Now, as it's been so hard to choose my favourite albums of this year, I'm doing 10 as a joint one. So the first of the albums at number 10. So 2020 has been a pretty good year for alternative hip-hop. You get the sense that there's been a new generation of alternative hip-hop artists that have been releasing solid and well-received albums across recent years, but have finally all come together this year. Tons of great releases coming from them this year, or simultaneously, feeling that they've really got a good grasp of how to master their style. There's been some good releases from Freddie Gibbs, finally a release from Jay Electronica, another great one from Rat Ferreira, Armand Hammer, West Side Gun. But for me, the absolute best of these has to be Clipping's Visions of Bodies Being Burned, which is an album I really wasn't expecting because, they only released their last album. There existed an Addiction to Blood last year, and all the fantastic qualities of that album are present on this one too. The production on this album is absolutely incredible. It's brilliantly, glitchy, hardcore, electronic, really rough, but also sleek in how effectively it's done. I think the best way to describe it would be like something you'd hear on a Death Grips album or a Young Fathers album or Kanye West's Yeezus. Yeah, it doesn't feel isolatingly experimental or too far out there. I think probably due to Daveed Diggs' work with Disney on musicals such as Moana and Hamilton, he still has a good sense of groove and hooks, so that when you're listening to these tracks, it's still glitchy, electronic, massive breakdowns, but you can still make out some great rhythms and grooves that keep it catchy and in your head and make it still so fantastically accessible. It's just hip-hop that is fantastically made, both thoroughly experimental yet still accessible, and feels thoroughly forward-thinking. Also, as a big film fan, loving the fact that Daveed Diggs is evidently a huge horror fan. It feels like there's tons of great gothic, grisly imagery laden throughout, and references to specific movies. Like, I'm still convinced that that the opening track, Say the Name, is a reference to the film Candyman. Which actually wouldn't make him the first alternative hip-hop artist to reference Candyman, since Kendrick also referenced it on one of the tracks on Damn. For my next number 10 pick, sometimes you get those albums that are just good. The instant you hear it, you just absolutely love it on first sight. Just like, I don't know why, but I love this. And that was what I got from the very first time I heard a track from this album. It is Yves Tamor's Heaven to a Tortured Mind. And the opening track to this album, Gospel for a New Century, is just easily one of my favourite tracks of 2020. Right away in my Spotify Wrapped, it made it into the top 10 of tracks I've listened to the most, and it just sounds absolutely grand and epic. I think what makes this album work so well is how brilliantly Yves Tamor is at mastering 4 different genres. You've got the good, great groove, catchiness and sexiness of an R&B album. You've got the good fuzzy, experimental and quirky personality that reflects IDM and experimental electropop, like with Arca. And you've also got some great guitar work and alternative indie flourishes right throughout the album. It's an album that's very reflective of the label it's on, Warp Records, which is most famously an IDM label known for artists such as Aphex Twin and Boards of Canada, but in more recent years has taken to a hybrid approach, signing artists that fuse R&B and hip-hop with the experimental electronica the label was more heavily known for, as noted with recent acts such as Flying Lotus and Kalela. And so I'd say that's the best way to approach this album, an R&B album that has tons of fantastic IDM flourishes. Like, to put it one way, it's like a Prince album, but if Arca handled the production. But I'd also heavily compare it to TV on the Radio's work. In fact, when I first heard it, I actually thought it was a solo project by the lead member of TV on the Radio. And there's also tons of production flourishes that remind me a lot of John Grant, particularly the horns on Gospel for a New Century, which seems similar to his track Pale Green Ghosts. Now for number 9, a very controversial pick, the 1975 Notes on a Conditional Form. And yes, I admit this album is extremely flawed. It's way too long at 22 tracks, and there's tons of tracks that are just really forgettable filler, which could have easily been cut to make it a more coherent project. And it does seem very incoherent in the constant switching between styles. But the 1975 have been one of my absolute favourite bands of the past 10 years. In fact, I Like It When You Sleep is one of my all-time favourite albums, and I just love every single move they do. I love their visual style in their music videos with the neon and the callbacks to art house films, and also the very retro 80s approach and how they almost seem to effectively recreate the anthemic new wave of Tears for Fears. And so as a result, I absolutely adore this album as well, even if I am thoroughly aware of its faults. I mean, it has the 1975 doing what the 1975 do best, recreating 80s new wave in fantastically catchy contemporary indie pop, particularly on the main single on this album, If You're Too Shy, Let Me Know, and the great epilogue track, Guys. But also really love the new styles and really love all the new things that they're trying on this album. Absolutely love the punk track, People, which is something no other current pop group I think would dare to do, which on Spotify has been my second most listened to track of the year. I just absolutely love it. And also how effective they've been at recreating the UK garage of the early 2000s on tracks like Frail State of Mind and Yeah, I Know. Tell a real passion and adoration for the genre on this album. And also their forays into electronica, which is what a lot of people really dislike about the band, but what I absolutely love. A lot of my favourite tracks on I Know I Like It When You Sleep were the hyper chilled out electronic instrumentals like Please Be Naked and the title track, and it's a lot of the similar case for me on this one, including Shiny Collarbone, which has a great Jamaican rave sort of style, which is, I feel if it was done by an actual electronic artist like John Hopkins or Bicep, it would be really well received. Now the next album on this list, at number 8, falls into the category of weird late night internet electronica album. So basically like the sort of thing you'd come across where, say, you're scrolling on YouTube at midnight and you come across an underground electronic album that started to trend, which has a really surreal, almost eerie sort of vibe to it, but yet is oddly relaxing and has a weird nostalgic value to it. Basically the sort of stuff like Machine Girl and a lot of vaporwave artists like Macintosh Plus. And one of the absolute great of that sort of style this year has been Draining Love Story by Sewer Slut, or if you want to bring them up in polite conversation, Junko. It's an album that's fantastically retro, it's perfect at recreating the drum and bass style of the 1990s. In fact, when I heard it, a lot of it reminded me of works by artists such as Goldie and LTJ Bookham. It also feels extremely contemporary, particularly in its use of anime samples in the mix, and also how it has an oddly nostalgic vibe that's very reminiscent of vaporwave, particularly in its use of styles that are very reminiscent of video game music from the early 2000s. In fact, Silent Hill is sampled on some of the tracks. Along with how a lot of people in the YouTube comments said it reminded them like a lot of the drum and bass that was used in between shows on Toonami. But like a lot of these weird late night internet electronic albums, it has a good eeriness to it, but it's also really relaxing. It's an album that almost seems to absorb you when you listen to it in the middle of the night and just takes you somewhere else. And I feel that's a vibe that is really hard to create, and Sewer Slut do it absolutely fantastically, and also how proficient they've been this year. 3 albums in 1 year, that's impressive. And now on to number 7. The tail end of 2020 has felt like 2009's made a massive comeback. We've had Kid Cudi doing another sequel to Man on the Moon. We've had yet another great album from Taylor Swift this year. In fact, I actually think Evermore is far better than Folklore. But more importantly this year, we had another 2009 icon make their big comeback. Lady Gaga on Chromatica. After flirting with country and musical influences on her previous 2 albums, Lady Gaga is now finally back to the electropop, which she is an absolute master of, and yes, the Queen has come back to reclaim her crown. I said she has perfectly mastered the art of catchy and flamboyant electropop, now with added influences. I said with Dua Lipa, the new emergence of new disco, as taking a strong forefront in current pop music, and also the fact that we have a collaboration between Lady Gaga and Elton John. I mean, if that isn't the most iconic LGBT collab of the year, I don't know what is. At number 6, Jessie Ware, What's Your Pleasure? An artist that's been producing great albums since 2011, has now released her masterwork. And similarly with Dua Lipa and Lady Gaga, it's another example of a fantastic new disco revival album, fusing together new disco, synth pop, funk, all in one great album that is just consistently brilliant throughout. It's an album you can dance and have a great time to, or just sit back and chill to. It's just a pure feel-good album that is masterfully produced. Now for number 5, 2020 has been an absolutely incredible year for women in electronic music. We've had some brilliant releases from Jada G, Jessie Lanza, Yaiji, but I'd say easily the best has to be In a Song by Kelly Lee Owens. She's an absolute master at the form of modern post-dubstep electronica that has been done by artists such as John Hopkins, which isn't surprising considering she's worked with him previously. Yet also has a great synth pop or indie pop aspect that helps add a sense of variety to this album, particularly Kelly's really beautiful vocals, adding a good sense of pacing to the album, so it's not just one long block of instrumentals, you have a good variance in between. A good switch between contemporary techno and retro style electropop with really chilled, soothing vocals. It's very reminiscent of some of the works by the artist Gweno. And that's not even getting to the masterpiece on this album that is The Corner of My Sky. Perfectly chilled out down tempo with a great guest feature from music legend John Cale, former member of the Velvet Underground. And it's a fantastic spoken word piece describing the beauty of the Welsh countryside, with some of it even sung in Welsh. Sounds really otherworldly and mystical, and considering I visited Snowdon earlier this year, he does a bloody good job of describing just how gorgeous it is up there.